Dungeons are without a doubt the most played aspect of Hypixel Skyblock. This shouldn't come as a surprise, as most people find them really enjoyable, and the loot that you can obtain from them is also extremely useful. However, trying to get started with dungeons in the earlier stages of Hypixel Skyblock can be quite challenging, especially if you're trying to join parties that already know how to actively grind the floor, while you're stuck with no prior experience trying to get your first completion. That's where this video comes in, your one-stop shop for all of the early game dungeon boss fights in Hypixel Skyblock. This video will cover how to complete every single boss fight from floors 1 to 6 of the catacombs, and I will also have a follow-up video specifically covering the floor 7 fight coming out over the next few weeks. But with all that being said, sit back, relax, and enjoy this ultimate guide to dungeons in Hypixel Skyblock. To get this video started, I'm going to address a couple of important points so you guys understand the goals of today's video. This video is supposed to be a beginner's guide for all of the lower level boss fights of the catacombs, specifically floors 1 through 6. I will not be covering the floor 7 fight in today's video, as there's just so much that I could cover on floor 7 that it can be an entire video on its own. I will also not be covering the master mode variants of every floor, because that would drag this video out for too long. This video will also focus specifically on the boss fights of all of these floors, not the basics of early game dungeons or how to do all the room clearing before the fights. Secondly, I also want to talk about all of the gear choices I will mention in this video. For each of the gear recommendation sections of every floor, I will cover 2 different types of gear recommendations. The first will be the bare minimum gear required to simply complete the floor, and the second will be the gear that's recommended if you want to reliably grind the floor for loot, catacombs XP, or any other reason. This is a very important distinction to make, because while some gear will be strong enough to get you your first couple of completions, oftentimes it's better to upgrade into something stronger if you want to stay on that floor you just completed and you want to keep grinding it. I will make sure to specify which gear options are considered the bare minimum and which ones you should be aiming for as the proper concrete upgrade, so don't worry too much about that. Next, I'm going to talk about current dungeon metas. As of right now, the current meta for floors 5 and below is to use a melee setup if you're playing Berserker, Tank, or Healer, while mages use a combination of melee and magic weapons, and archers will be using bows. However, once you start to reach floors 6 and above, this is where every class except for mage switches to a bow as their main weapon. This is because melee before floor 6 is a very cheap and powerful option to get you started, but it's quickly outclassed once you start to reach floor 6 and above. Class diversity before floor 6 also isn't a really big priority to complete the floors, which allows you to just pour all of your money into one good melee or berserker setup that works, and then just pick whatever class is free in your party and run the dungeon knowing that you'll just perform fine. This all changes dramatically past floor 6, but because I am saving floor 7 for a separate video, I will talk about proper class diversity in my follow-up video where it actually matters. For now, I will mostly talk about berserker setups, but remember that these do apply even if you're playing tank or healer. That being said, the structure of today's video will be as follows. First, I will cover gear recommendations for the entrance floor and then how to complete its respective boss fight. Then I will do the same for floors 1 to 6, and I'll leave timestamps on the video for you to flick through if you please. This video does assume that you already understand the very fundamental aspects of dungeons, such as room clearing, the different classes, etc. But if you don't, I will have a separate beginner's dungeon guide in the description of this video that you can refer to. This video will have full focus on each floor's boss fights and the best strategies to beat them. So with all that being said, let's just move on to the first floor of this video. The very first proper dungeon floor of the catacombs is floor 1, but to reach floor 1, you have to complete the entrance first. The entrance is unlocked at combat 15, however, I'd highly suggest doing this floor at combat 16 and above, because that's when you start to unlock all the dragon sets. While it is possible to complete the entrance in gear as weak as hardened diamond, lapis, or ender armor, you'll find much more success saving up for unstable or strong dragon armor instead. These sets are obtained at combat 16 and 18 respectively, and are easily the best early game armor sets that any player can get their hands on. If you are opting out for the mage class, then you should be using wise dragon armor instead, as this will buff your intelligence much more. But aside from that, Unstable and Strong will work perfectly for all of the other classes. As for what weapons you should use, an Aspect of the End or Aspect of the Dragons will be your best bet for the non-mage classes, as these are easily the best early game weapons to get started with in dungeons. Unfortunately for the mage class, the only viable Catacombs 0 requirement mage weapon is the Frozen Scythe, which is pretty expensive and I wouldn't recommend getting it for the entrance fight. But if you do get it for the entrance boss fight, you can take this into floor 1 later, so you're not really wasting any money here, you're just buying the item earlier than when you need it. As for the entrance boss fight, take the term boss fight very loosely, since this really isn't a boss fight. The entrance floor just requires you to successfully clear the blood room to count it as complete, and that isn't actually a boss fight that you can do afterwards. All you need to do to successfully beat this floor is to clear every room that's locked behind a wither door and make your way to the end of the dungeon to open the blood door. You don't actually have to clear any other rooms, just the ones that are being locked by wither doors. Once the blood door has been opened, the Watcher will start to spawn a bunch of different blood room mobs to try and take you out, but once you've killed them all, the dungeon will complete, grant you some Catacombs XP, and let you move on to floor 1. Unlike the entrance floor, floor 1 actually poses a legitimate challenge. This floor is unlocked at Catacombs 1, which should be obtainable off of just one decently scored entrance completion. If you haven't got the requirements, you might have to redo the entrance floor again, but assuming that you have, here's what you'll need. The absolute bare minimum to complete this floor will be the full Ender Armor set and a Void Sword or Dragon Shortbow as any class that isn't mage. This will work, especially in a party with 4 other players, however, it is not recommended and you might struggle. I would recommend bare minimum gear for the mage class, but the bare minimum gear is the same as the recommended gear, so I'll just talk about what you should be using instead. Opting for strong or unstable dragon armor with an Aspect of the Dragons or Dragon Shortbow is definitely a better choice than the End Armor and Void Sword / Dragon Shortbow combo. This will work really well for all of your non-mage classes, and if you do want to play mage on this floor, then I'd suggest full Wise Dragon Armor and a Frozen Scythe. This will be your most cost-effective option, although still much more expensive than the non-mage options, and it also meets all of the Catacombs requirements since most mage weapons all have Catacomb requirements. Pet recommendations for the non-mage classes consists of any reasonably priced combat pet that you can get your hands on, such as a rare Enderman pet or a common griffin. The main thing you'll want on your pet is the Dwarf Turtle Shellmet item, since taking no knockback during the fight is extremely useful. If you are playing mage, then an epic sheep pet will be very beneficial, but any cheap combat pet will still do the trick. I will have a pet comparison video coming out over the next few weeks, so I'll leave a link to that in the description of this video once it's posted. You'll also want to have around 100 magical power before tackling floor 1. While this isn't technically necessary, magical power is really important to boost your damage or intelligence, and it's highly recommended to have some for any combat related tasks. Bloody or Silky as your power stone of choice will work for all non-mage classes, while Inspired or Sighted are better for mage. Now that we've covered all the gear though, upon entering the floor 1 boss fight, you'll be placed in a relatively large arena surrounded by pillars with the boss in the center. The boss on this floor is called Bonzo, and he'll say some dialogue at the start of the fight before dashing into a random direction away from the player. After a few seconds, he'll start to spawn in a bunch of his minions called undeads, and these will target you and attempt to weaken your health. Bonzo himself will also launch wither skulls at you and periodically jump from pillar to pillar if he's not killed fast enough. Typically, this pillar to pillar behavior can be avoided if you deal enough damage to him quickly, which with a full party is very easy to pull off even with weaker gear. Once Bonzo is killed, he'll lay on the floor pretending to be dead while saying more dialogue. This is where he'll enter phase 2, where he turns into a clown and starts dashing at the player. Bonzo gains a significant damage buff in this stage and becomes much more aggressive, so be very careful when he does. He also stops spawning undeads and launching wither skulls and tries to melee you and throw balloons at you instead. If you do manage to survive long enough and weaken him a decent amount, Bonzo will sprint straight to the center of the arena and do a balloon barrage attack. This is where he spins around in a circle, launching balloons from every direction at a really fast pace, and it's advised that players stand behind the pillars in the fight to avoid this. It is possible to kill him while he is barraging, but if you're not careful, a few balloon hits will instantly kill you, so it's best to wait for his attack to finish before trying to kill him again. Dropping his health to 0 for the second time will beat the boss completely, granting you your dungeon chest loot and catacombs XP as a reward. Overall, this boss fight is very straightforward and easy to pick up, and with a bit of practice, you'll be able to clear it with little trouble at all. Moving on to floor 2 now, this floor is unlocked at Catacombs 3, which can easily be obtained off of a few floor 1 runs. Gear requirements for this floor are very similar to floor 1, so let me run through them really quick. The bare minimum gear for this floor is the unstable or strong dragon set that you would have used to grind floor 1, with the same aspect of the dragons or dragon shortbow from before. Bare minimum mage gear is still wise dragon armor, but switching to a bonzo staff from the frozen scythe is recommended now that you have the floor 1 completion. If you do choose to sell the frozen scythe, you'll also save yourself a bunch of money and you'll be able to buy the bonzo staff with it, so it is a good option to do. The recommended gear if you want to grind this floor comfortably would be superior dragon armor for all of the non-mage classes, an AOTD with a dragon fused glove for berserkers, or the dragon shortbow if you are still playing archer. The wise dragon and bonzo staff mage setup is still valid for floor 2, however, using superior dragon with mage reforges isn't a bad option if you have the money to do so and you want more survivability when you play mage. This setup won't do as much damage as Wise Dragon, but it will definitely help significantly with survivability. Similar to floor 1, any decent combat pet will work well for non-mages, so just keep what you were using for floor 1 if you're unsure about upgrading. Mages should still be using the epic sheep pet because this will be the best for mage. At this stage, you should absolutely have 100 magical power at the absolute minimum, but shooting for about 150 and above isn't too much harder to obtain and will definitely improve your quality of life. Non-mage classes should still be using the bloody or silky power stone, while mages should have swapped to sighted by now. As for the floor 2 boss fight, the room you spawn in is similar to Bonzo's in size, but this time you face the boss Scarf and he's located in the center of the room. While Scarf is the main boss that you need to kill in floor 2, he's actually untouchable in the first phase, locked behind barriers in the center pedestal. To get Scarf into his second phase, you have to first take out all of his minions, located on the outskirts of the boss room in each of their respective crypts. Each minion has its own unique capabilities, so I'll list them off for you here. The Priest is the most important minion of the 4, and should be the one that you and your team target first. This is because the Priest can heal all of the other minions at a very rapid pace, and if he's not stopped, he will never let you take out the other minions. The Warrior is the second most important minion, because he's the most aggressive and deals the most damage. The Warrior will choose any player as its target, change their camera angle, and dash straight towards them, dealing massive damage in the process. This attack can be avoided by quickly teleporting away before he hits you, but this technique takes a bit of practice to get good at. Targeting the Warrior after the Priest is dead is the best play to get the threat out ASAP. The Mage and the Archer are the other two minions, and these are nowhere near as dangerous as the other two because they kind of just sit in their own corners and they don't do anything until provoked. The Archer has a handful of ranged attacks while the Mage has some too, and once the Priest and Warrior aren't running around anymore, it's not really hard to just kill the last two minions with the help of your team. Once these minions have been taken out, the barriers around Scarf start to flicker, signaling that they're about to break. He also says a bunch of dialogue which can be used to determine if he's about to enter the second phase or not. Once in second phase, Scarf revives all of his minions back to full health and his barriers drop, letting him run freely across the boss room. Players should target the Priest a second time to get him out of the fight as soon as possible, because without this, he'll simply just heal Scarf over and over and you'll eventually lose the fight. Taking out the Warrior shortly after the Priest is a good call. However, depending on the strength of your party, sometimes you can just tackle the Warrior and Scarf at the same time. Once these two minions are gone, you can ignore the last two minions and just focus on Scarf. A decent party should be able to take out Scarf before he does any of his really dangerous attacks, but if you can't, be very cautious of this. His main deadly attack is when he begins to levitate in the air and then launches a flurry of Wither Skulls straight at the player, basically insta-killing anyone that gets caught in it. Running in circles or hiding behind some blocks is a great way to counter this, and once he finishes his attack, you can proceed with just fighting him as normal until his health drops to 0 and you've completed the fight. This boss fight is definitely much more challenging than Floor 1, and it tends to be quite tricky for newer players when they first try it out. My best recommendation for this is to work on over-leveling your catacomb skill just a bit before trying to get your completion, as well as practicing the floor a few times with other players so that you get the hang of it. You can also overgear by getting that superior set that I mentioned earlier if you still find yourself struggling and you'd like that survivability. Once you've completed Floor 2, Floor 3 is the next challenge that awaits. This floor is unlocked at Catacombs 5 and is easily obtained off of some Floor 2 runs, but it can also be pretty easily obtained with Floor 1. Bear in mind that you do have to complete Floor 2 once to even attempt Floor 3 though, so if you are choosing to grind Floor 1 for Catacombs XP, make sure you've beaten Floor 2 already. As for gear requirements, they are as follows. The bare minimum requirements for the non-mage classes is Unstable Dragon and Strong Dragon Armor yet again, with the same AOTD and Dragon Fused Glove for Berserkers, or the Dragon Shortbow for Archers. Mages should still be using Wise Dragon Armor and a Bonzo Staff, as this is still viable for a Floor 3 completion. If you did have the funds to afford a superior set for the Floor 2 completion, then this will work even better than the bare minimum requirements for Floor 3. As for the recommended gear to grind the floor, this is where stuff actually starts to change. All classes should be using adaptive armor as soon as you obtain the Floor 3 completion. If you can afford it, purchasing a golden professor head will also be better than an adaptive helmet for the non-mage classes, while mages can use the shadow goggles purchased from Ophelia. As for weapons, dungeonizing and starring your Aspect of the Dragons or Dragon Shortbow is a must as soon as you unlock the requirements, which is obtained after Catacombs 10 and 8 respectively. The Bonzo Staff is already a dungeon weapon, so just make sure it's 5-starred if you're playing mage. At this stage, mages should also consider upgrading from an epic sheep pet into a legendary, but a high-level epic will still work just fine if you don't want to upgrade. Giving your previously leveled epic sheep pet to cat is also a good option when you look into upgrading. Non-mages should look into getting a slightly stronger combat pet, such as a legendary Wither Skeleton, rare Tiger, or even a legendary Megalodon, but this all depends on your budget and which one interests you the most. Floor 3 is also the floor where you can start going for equipment pieces, because this floor unlocks the Adaptive Belt, the first dungeonized equipment piece that you'll get along your dungeon journey. All non-mage classes should go for the Adaptive Belt, while mages should purchase the Implosion Belt. Classes using the AOTD should already have the Dragon Fused Glove, and if not, an Ender Cloak will suffice for those that don't use the AOTD. Filling out the other 2 equipment slots with an Ender Necklace and Ender Cloak will also work just fine for the meantime. The Balloon Snake is another option that you can use in the necklace slot, but the jump boost can be a bit awkward to work with, so just be mindful about that. Having around 200 magical power for this fight is definitely the recommended amount, so be sure to reach that before you tackle Floor 3. Bloody and Silky still remain the best power stones for the non-mage classes, and Sighted is still your best bet for mage. Moving on to the Floor 3 boss fight though, you're greeted with the boss in the center of the room once again, surrounded by a bunch of barriers. This boss is called the Professor, and surrounding the Professor are 4 guardians in these big green chamber things, which each have their own individual properties and need to be killed before you can damage the Professor. The difference between the Guardians in Floor 3 and the minions in Floor 2 is that the Guardians will respawn at 50% health after 10 seconds, meaning that you need to kill all 4 of them within a 10-second time window that starts when the first one is killed. If you can't kill the Guardians fast enough from full health, a good strategy is to weaken them all individually first, and then go along and knock them out one by one to get rid of them that way. However, it is extremely important to understand the abilities of each of these Guardians, so these are as follows. The Chaos Guardian is the deadliest of the bunch and should be targeted as soon as possible, similar to how the Priest is a target in Floor 2. The Chaos Guardian prepares an attack called Discharge, which takes 10 seconds for it to fully charge, and it will activate if the Guardian is not killed before then. This attack strikes lightning on you and your team and can only be dodged by keeping a really far distance away from the Chaos Guardian. If you unsuccessfully kill the Guardian in time and you're too close to him, it's basically an instant death. The damage this thing does is immense. The next most important Guardian is the Healthy Guardian. This Guardian has a Giga Heal ability, which if you let it charge up fully, it will heal all of the other living Guardians to full HP. The Giga Heal can be stopped if you deal enough damage to the Healthy Guardian while it's charging it, so this is preventable if you are paying attention. The Laser Guardian is the next most annoying Guardian to deal with, as this one will charge up a laser attack that will deal massive damage and knockback to the player. You can negate the knockback with the Shelmet though, so make sure your combat pet does have one equipped. The Reinforced Guardian is the most tame of the 4, and also has 200,000 more HP than the 3 other Guardians. This Guardian realistically just acts as a bit more of a meat shield compared to the others, but it does have a pretty weak TNT rain attack where it spews out TNT all around it, damaging nearby players. This is by far the least threatening attack and the easiest to dodge though, so it's not that high of a priority. Once all 4 Guardians have been killed within 10 seconds, the barriers around the Professor start to flicker before disappearing entirely and dropping him on the floor. This is where you and your team can freely attack him however you please, and is definitely the easiest part of the boss fight. Weakening the Professor enough in this second phase will unlock his third and final phase. This is where he harnesses his supposed ultimate Guardian power, by merging all 4 of the previously knocked out Guardians and fusing them with his own body. Here, the Professor gains all 4 of the Guardian abilities as a big Guardian with 3 million health, and he will attempt to kill the player using all 4 abilities. The boss room also begins to slowly flood with water in this final phase of the fight to add to the difficulty, posing a minor challenge to you and your team if you don't kill him fast enough. Typically, this will never actually affect your fight though, since taking out the Professor in the final stage just requires your team to unleash all your ultimate abilities at once, while standing on the center platform when he merges. Beating this final Guardian will complete the boss fight, granting you your loot and XP rewards. All in all, this is by far the most involved boss fight thus far, but it is definitely a lot easier than it looks. Recommendations for this fight is to overgear slightly if you find yourself having a little bit of trouble, but practicing this floor to get all the muscle memories down will definitely be the main way to improve at this boss fight. Moving on to floor 4 though, this floor is unlocked at Catacombs 9, which can easily be obtained off of some floor 3 runs. While it is possible to get these requirements off of floor 2s or even floor 1s, floor 2 tends to be arguably more difficult than floor 3, and floor 1 is just too slow. Completing floor 3 gains access to a handful of new gear upgrades though, which leads me to the recommended gear for floor 4. The bare minimum requirements for all classes on floor 4 is full adaptive armor with an AOTD and Dragon Fuse glove for berserkers, a dungeonized and 5-star Dragon Shortbow for archers, and the Bonzo staff for mages. Mages should also be using the shadow goggles instead of the adaptive helmet for this floor, because it is cheaper than the adaptive helmet and it will be much better. Recommended gear for floor 4 is a little bit different though, with a dungeonized AOTD being the weapon of choice for berserkers, a spirit shortbow for archers, and the spirit scepter for mages. Floor 4 offers excellent weapon upgrades for the archer and mage class, so be sure to take advantage of it when you get the completion. Upgrading to a dungeonized superior set once you reach Catacombs 14 is also a great idea for the non-mage classes, and upgrading to 3/4 dungeonized Wise with shadow goggles is viable if you are playing mage. You can still use Superior as a mage if you like the extra EHP, but be sure to reforge everything to Necrotic and Loving so you get the maximum intelligence possible. As for pet choices, the same combat pets from before will be ideal for both mages and non-mages. Pet upgrades will remain the same for the rest of this video, so I'm not going to specify it in every gear upgrade section from now on. Pets are a very flexible part of your profile that you don't have to worry too much about, as long as you have something that's powerful at your level. My personal pick would be the legendary Wither Skeleton or the legendary Megalodon, but a Tiger or Griffin at rare or above are other popular meta picks that do work. Equipment upgrades for floor 4 is just the Bone Necklace, since the requirements are unlocked upon completion. If you're not using the AOTD, a Gauntlet of Contagion will also be a good upgrade from the Ender Gauntlet or Dragon Fuse Glove. Using an Ender Cloak and Implosion Belt for the remaining slots will suffice great moving forward, since the Ender Cloak is the best thing for the time being, and the Implosion Belt will last until you reach Master Mode dungeons. You can easily get away with 250 magical power to reliably complete floor 4, but it's definitely recommended to be shooting higher so you don't have to make those upgrades later on. Bloody and Silky are still the best non-mage power stones though, and Sighted is still your best bet for mage. As for the floor 4 boss fight, this is a very different style of boss fight compared to the previous floors. This boss room is a giant arena, which will periodically fill up with many different spirit animals that will try to kill you. The upper level doesn't spawn any of these animals, but it does spawn spirit bats, which will try to kill you if you stay up the top for too long. The boss for this floor is called Thorn, a ghast that flies around the arena while you kill all of the spirit animals, and he cannot be damaged with regular attacks. To beat this flaw, you need to kill enough spirit animals to spawn in a spirit bear. You can tell how close you are to spawning a spirit bear by looking at whether the coal ring around the grandstands has turned into sea lanterns or not, where a fully lit up ring of sea lanterns means that a bear is about to spawn. The spirit bear will always spawn in the center of arena, and you can tell when this is happening by the particles that will hit the very middle, and once he is killed, he will drop a spirit bow which will always spawn a few blocks away from where he died. The player is supposed to pick up the spirit bow and shoot Thorn with it, and this process needs to be repeated 4 times before Thorn is fully eliminated and the floor is complete. The trickiest part about this floor isn't actually dealing with the large cluster of mobs that spawn, but rather not missing the spirit bow shots on Thorn. Thorn speeds up the more damage he takes, and when he's 1 shot away from dying, he starts to change directions and really vary his movements. This can be stopped by getting a member of your party to stun Thorn, which keeps him completely still so you're no longer trying to hit a moving target. Thorn can be stunned with a handful of different items, but the cheapest and most commonly used is the Tribal Spear. To stun him, all you need to do is right-click the Tribal Spear so the projectile hits Thorn, and keep continuously hitting him over and over so he doesn't move around. The best places to stun Thorn are in the grandstands, which means that you'll have to deal with all the spirit bats since they target players that aren't in the main arena. To prevent this, all you need to do is place a few decoys down at the very start of the run, and make sure to do this near the spot that you'll be stunning from. The decoys will grab the attention of all of the spirit bats, which will let you freely stun the boss while your team does the rest of the work. In a typical party, the tank will shoot the spirit bows and the berserker or healer will be the one stunning, but you can figure out who does what in your parties to whatever works best for you. As long as you have an efficient mob clearer in the arena, you should be okay when running this floor. All in all, this floor is quite simple and definitely nowhere near as challenging as the previous ones. This is largely due to the fact that overgearing for it is really easy, and the gear it provides is also super good, and the only difficulty comes with making sure that your team is coordinated enough to beat the floor efficiently. Now that floor 4 is out of the way, I can talk about one of the most popular dungeon floors, floor 5. This floor is unlocked at Catacombs 14 and can very easily be unlocked off of floor 4 or floor 3 completions. Gear recommendations for this floor are quite exciting, especially with what the floor 5 completion unlocks. The bare minimum requirements for the non-mage classes on this floor is adaptive armor with either the adaptive helmet or a golden livid head, depending on what you can afford. As per usual, mages should still be using shadow goggles instead of the golden helmets. Berserkers should be using a Dungeonized and 5-starred AOTD, while archers should have swapped to a Spirit Shortbow by now, and mages should be using a Spirit Scepter. As for the recommended gear for this floor, you should be using full Dungeonized Superior for all classes except Mage, which should be using 3/4 Dungeonized Wise Dragon with Shadow Goggles. Alternatively, 3/4 Shadow Assassin with a Golden Livid Head is another viable option for the non-mage classes, and can be considered if you haven't already got Superior. Berserkers should be using a Shadow Fury upgraded with Livid Fragments as their weapon of choice, while archers should still be using a Spirit Shortbow, and mages should be dual wielding both a Shadow Fury and their Spirit Scepter. Equipment for this floor consists of upgrading from the Ender Cloak to the Shadow Assassin Cloak, because completing floor 5 unlocks these requirements. At this stage, upgrading to a Gauntlet of Contagion for non-AOTD users is also a viable choice, since the Ender Gauntlet is outclassed. The Bone Necklace and the Implosion Belt are still the best equipment pieces for these slots, and they won't get outclassed for the rest of this video. It's best to do this floor with around 350 magical power, but as expected, it's always recommended to do it with more if possible. Bloody and Silky are still the best reforges for non-mage classes, but if you can afford it, you can start to consider Hurtful as a stronger upgrade. Mages should be using Sighted if they are struggling with intelligence or mana regeneration, but if not, switch to Silky as this will provide much stronger LCM damage without harming clear potential. This is the part of the video where I talk about the Mage class and what you need to do if you want to play it seriously from floor 5 and beyond. If you do want to play the Mage class seriously on floor 5 and any future floors, then you'll have to start playing a mix of RCM and LCM rather than just the traditional RCM mage. RCM stands for right-click mage, which is when you play the mage class solely by using magic abilities that activate on right-click and consume mana. LCM, or left-click mage, is when you use the mage beam left-click attack to deal damage, and this tends to be significantly stronger than RCM for single targets. As a result, keeping the Spirit Scepter as an RCM weapon is excellent for clearing the rooms prior to the boss, while using a Shadow Fury as your left-click weapon is viable for mini-boss rooms during the clear or the actual boss fight itself. Using a proper mage setup is extremely rewarding and also a lot of fun, but it is insanely expensive and definitely much higher skill cap than any other class, so be very mindful of this if you do want to take mage seriously. Nonetheless, now I can move on to the floor 5 boss mechanics. The boss for this floor is called Livid, and the room that you spawn into is a very standard wide open boss room, just like all the other ones. As for the fight itself, there are no gimmicks like needing a spirit bow to shoot Thorn or 3 different stages like the Professor. All you need to do is kill the correct Livid, and the fight is over. This is a lot easier said than done though, because once the fight starts, Livid will duplicate himself 8 different times, leaving you with 9 different Livids that you have to worry about. If you kill the incorrect Livid, that Livid will regenerate to full health and heal all of the other Livids, effectively forcing you to start again. This boss has a variety of different mechanics to try and take you out, such as periodically blinding you, teleporting away from you, or dashing at you when you least expect it, and it has some other typical attacks like melee attacks, bow shots, or throwing potions at you. If you're not prepared, Livid can very easily take you out with the help of his 8 other clones, so it's important that you understand his one fatal weakness, the ceiling of the boss fight. Yes, that's right, the ceiling of the boss room is Livid's biggest weakness. If you pay close attention to each Livid clone, you'll notice that they're all colored differently, and they also have slightly different names, and the helmets that they're wearing are all slightly different. Coincidentally, the color of the correct Livid's name and the mask that he's wearing corresponds to the color of the wool blocks in the ceiling of the boss room, which means that if you take a quick glance at the ceiling as soon as the fight starts, you'll immediately know which Livid you need to target. Once you've identified the correct Livid, you and your party can single him out using utility items such as an Ice Spray wand or a Gyrokinetic wand, and if this is too expensive for you, you should be fine just focusing the correct color and trying your best not to damage the wrong ones. If this boss fight wasn't easy enough as it is, there are also mods out there that will box and highlight the correct Livid, and some mods will even hide the incorrect Livids from even showing up on your screen. I have left a link to an ultimate Skyblock mods folder video in the description of this video, so you can always check that out when you get the chance and use the mods in that video. Nonetheless, killing the correct Livid will complete the boss fight and grant you your rewards, and all in all, this is probably the easiest of all the boss fights respective to the recommended gear and catacombs requirements. However, with floor 5 done and out of the way, now I can talk about the final floor of this video, floor 6. This floor is unlocked at Catacombs 19 and can easily be obtained off of floor 5 runs, but it's also pretty viable to do this off of floor 4s if you wanted to for some weird reason. Nonetheless, the gear requirements for this floor are very important because this is where class diversity starts to make a little bit of an appearance. The bare minimum requirements for the non-mage classes is definitely a full Dungeonized Superior set or 3/4 Shadow Assassin with a golden Satan head. Tanks should also consider bringing a separate tank set such as 3/4 tier 9 or above perfect armor with a Bonzo's mask or Reaper mask as the helmet. Protect the Dragon is also a pretty solid tank set at a much cheaper cost, but it has lower resale value and it's not as good. If you do opt for Protect the Dragon, make sure you do Dungeonize the pieces though, because if you don't, then this set is going to be really bad. Mages should still be using 3/4 Wise Dragon with Shadow Goggles, as well as a Shadow Fury and Spirit Scepter as their weapons of choice. Berserkers should still be using a Shadow Fury, and archers can get away with using a Spirit Shortbow. The recommended gear for floor 6 is vastly different to the bare minimum. Typically, tanks should be using a Bonzo's or Reaper mask, tier 9 or above perfect chestplate, and then Necromancer leggings and boots for their tank set, as this is the best tank setup pre-floor 7. Berserkers can upgrade into a giant sword once they have the stats and the funds to do so, but they can also swap to a Juju shortbow as this tends to be a better option anyways. Mages can also upgrade their Shadow Fury into a giant sword, but they should keep the Spirit Scepter for clearing. Archers should be pushing for Juju shortbow requirements at this stage, so having a Juju shortbow just like the Berserker class will be a much better upgrade to the Spirit shortbow. Armor stays mostly the same pre-floor 7 though, with the best damaging setups being full Superior or 3/4 Shadow Assassin for non-mages, and 3/4 Wise Dragon for mages. Mages can upgrade into Wither Goggles as soon as they obtain a floor 6 completion, replacing their previous Shadow Goggles. Mage pet choices change slightly on floor 6, because this is where mages should start to invest in both a sheep pet and a typical combat pet. Recommended combat pets for mage are anything that doesn't predominantly provide strength, but instead provides crit damage or raw base damage. This is because the LCM beam is unaffected by strength, but it is affected by crit damage, raw damage, and intelligence. Equipment changes slightly in floor 6 as this floor drops the Soul Weaver gloves. Typically, the Gauntlet of Contagion is equally as good or sometimes better, but in most cases, the Soul Weaver gloves will provide a better stat boost if you aren't playing mage. If it appeals to you, it can be a good substitute to the Gauntlet of Contagion, but ultimately, this is just personal preference. Bear in mind that if you are using the Gauntlet of Contagion, regardless of what setup you have, make sure you pair it with the Implosion Belt instead of the Adaptive Belt, because this will actually buff the Gauntlet of Contagion's damage, and overall is just a good synergy. You should have about 400 magical power to comfortably complete floor 6, especially if you're one of the main DPS classes. Having Hurtful as your damaging reforge will pay off tremendously for non-mage classes. However, Itchy is a solid DPS option for archers specifically. If you still can't afford Hurtful and you're playing non-archer or non-mage classes, just go with Bloody or Silky for the time being because they still will work fine. Using Silky as a mage instead of Sighted will also massively boost your LCM damage for the boss fight though, so you should be looking to switch to Silky if you're playing mage, as you should have enough intelligence to sustain it. And now for the floor 6 boss fight, easily the most challenging and most involved fight that I'll be covering in this video. The boss for this floor is called Satan or Sedan, but similar to floor 3, you don't actually fight Satan himself until the very end of the fight. Instead, you first have to deal with an onslaught of mobs called Terracottas, followed up by the Sleeping Golems and then Satan's Giants before you fight Satan himself. This fight relies heavily on a solid tank and a really good DPS, meaning that coordination is essential to successfully clearing this floor. To complete floor 6, the first step is to clear out the Terracottas at the start of the fight. There are two ways to clear out the Terracottas. The first is to just wait out the 1-minute timer until Satan gets bored and despawns them, or you can actively take them out, which will lower the amount of waiting you need to do. Tanking the damage is much harder and also more time consuming than just taking them out, so I'll be teaching you how to kill the Terracottas in this video. The easiest way to do this is to huddle your entire team in the portal that you spawn in from, or somewhere along the entrance corridor where you're not in a wide open space. As long as your tank is within range of the rest of the team, you shouldn't take too much damage in this phase, but if you have a healer to help keep the tank and the rest of the team alive, it will make things much easier. On the other hand, the DPS classes need to output as much damage as possible on the Terracottas while they swarm the team, taking them out as quickly as possible. Archers can use their explosive shot to deal AoE damage to the cluster of mobs, while Berserkers and Mages can just focus using their normal attacks. Depending on your setup, you might want to LCM clear instead of RCM clear the Terracottas, since you'll likely drain your mana really quickly if you do RCM. Once Satan gets bored, he'll say some dialogue and the second phase of the fight starts. You and your party need to move to the center of the boss room now to take out all 4 of the giants that will drop from their respective cages. Typically, the archer will take out giants 1 and 4, while the mage targets the second giant, and the berserker and healer will double up on giant 3. That being said, the giants that you and your team decide to go for doesn't really matter too much as long as you take them out with ease and don't struggle. The tank should always stay somewhere in the center though, or at least somewhere near the whole team, because that way they can absorb all the damage that the other classes take. The tank should also activate their ultimate ability if they didn't use it during the Terracotta phase, because this is the part of the fight where the most damage will be taken. Your party can also kill the sleeping golems in this phase if they haven't already, as this will prepare the room for Satan himself. After the giants have been wiped out, the final stage of the boss begins. The center of the boss room will open up a big hole, revealing a 5th and final giant that has been hiding the entire time. Be cautious not to fall in this hole because it will instantly kill you and your tank in the process. After the giant has been pulled out of the hole, Satan will come out of his seat and merge with the giant, allowing you to fight Satan himself as this big, powerful giant. While this does look intimidating, all it takes is for you and your team to activate all your abilities and ultimate abilities and just load all your attacks on him at the same time. Satan typically is the easiest part of the fight since the strength of your party outweighs his EHP dramatically, and once you take him out, the boss fight is complete and you're given your rewards. All in all, this is by far the most challenging fight from the first 6 floors of the catacombs, and most of it just comes from the massive difficulty spike found in the terracotta stage. Recommendations to beat this floor is to overgear if you can, especially if you're playing tank. Additionally, finding a party that's willing to practice with you will also pay off nicely, because this floor is definitely much more team-oriented and harder to pull off as a solo. And now that I've finished covering floor 6, that officially concludes the end of today's video. Hopefully you did find this useful, informative, or enjoyable in some way, and if you did, be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing to this channel. If you also find other people who you think might benefit from this guide, especially when trying to use Party Finder, then be sure to link this video to them, because that way, we'll have more competent teammates rather than deadweights that notoriously fill the low-level Party Finder. But with all that being said, that's it for everything that I had for this video, and I'll see you next week for my comprehensive Floor 7 guide.